components, development, stories, Storybook. Hi everybody, thanks for watching. I'm Paul Everett, JetBrains developer advocate for web stuff, for Python stuff, joined by my colleague Ebenezer Don. Hey Ebenezer, how's it going?
Yeah, I'm doing really great. I've been monitoring the recent battle between SPAs and MPAs. Like everyone has like different opinions these days.
Yeah, everybody has opinions. This is our second kind of reaction-ish video. Ebenezer, you led the last one?
Yeah, that was about WebAssembly. It was a WASM review app by Dustin Brett. Really cool. You should check out the reaction video and you should check out the WebAssembly application, like an OS in the browser. Really cool.
Today, we're going to talk about component-driven development, breaking your work into stories, and then putting a gorgeous UI on that with a fairly popular open source package called Storybook. Ebenezer, ever heard of it?
Yep, I've heard of Storybook. I've even watched your video about Storybook, but it's a good thing we're doing this so that I can ask you as many questions as I have about Storybook today.
Yeah, and that was a little bit of a teaser. Let's jump right in.
Sure.
So, Ebenezer, what front-end frameworks have been on your radar this year?
React has to be there because I've been working with React a lot this year. But then Vue, Svelte, I'm closely monitoring Svelte. I want to start building like at least medium-sized to large projects with it. I also have Astro on my mind and Solid.js.
Yep. And a little bit of Angular. It's doing some new things as well. I think it's safe to say that all of those that you just mentioned kind of have component as the central organizing principle. What does component mean to you?
Yeah, and that's one thing I've really loved about these frameworks. They introduced me, the frameworks, React, for example, introduced me to components. And then I've even applied that to regular JavaScript, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And that's like, it's instead of having one large code base, one huge application and say, take everything here, I can break it down into different components that are reusable. I can use them in multiple places inside and outside of my application, which is really cool. So multiple reusable bits of code. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. You're kind of saying that you want to decompose the big pile into smaller piles so it's easier to think about. And then when you do that, you have reuse, and you can get reuse through props that can be passed in to customize under different circumstances. Does that all sound about right?
Yeah, sure, exactly.
I know under the hood, especially when you look at Ryan Carniato and Svelte and stuff, there's a lot of interest in high-speed diffing and stuff like that. But the way we use a component is a small unit that can be customized through prompts. Out of this has kind of come a way of development that's become dominant in front ends, component-driven development. I've got a website up for it, component-driven user interfaces. It's one of those putting a label on stuff we already know. But Ebenezer, when you're doing something big-ish, do you start at the bottom with tiny things and work up, little tiny dumb components or presentation components, whatever you want to call them? Or do you start at the top and then refactor down as you find those little units?
I usually start at the bottom and then to the top because it's easier small to big than big to small. So it's much easier to start at the top. You divide everything or section everything into components and then you build up. You can easily add or subtract than, let's say you finish building and then you want to add other stuff and you realize, oh, I need to break this down, and then start breaking and refactoring and changing your code base. Yeah, that's a much more difficult process for me. Yeah,
why don't we do that audience question thing? Hey, everyone out there, what do you do? Do you start at the top and then refactor into smaller components, or do you start at a little tiny thing and then gradually work your way up? Let us know down in the comments.
Yeah, let us know. How about you, Paul? What you do?
I'm in the middle of a rewrite of the guide and the WebStorm guide, and I started top down, and now I flipped my mind and went to bottom up. So different times I like one versus the other.
Oh, cool.
So that's components and component-driven development. There's this tool called Storybook for organizing and automating component-driven development. As kind of a shameless plug, I did a review and an illustration of Storybook in an unboxing style video, giving kind of the why, the what, and the how. And for the topic of our chat today, Ebenezer, I have a blog post up about using using Storybook with 11D of all things. Okay, on to the topic of today's little chit chat, the topic of the blog post, Storybook with 11D. Here's 11D, a static site generator. You should kind of think of it as Jekyll or Hugo, but written in JavaScript. Very much a server rendered, no JavaScript rendering in the browser, no React component kind of thingy. It's just HTML. And Storybook is really known for working with React single page applications, or I think you were interested in talking about Storybook with Vue or Angular and other things like that. There are bundled and add-on integrations for popular front-end frameworks. But what if you don't have a front-end framework? What if Storybook isn't rendering components, something else is? And that's where this thing comes in. What if you just have vanilla JS, or even less, you just got static HTML? You can actually use Storybook and stories for something that is rendering the HTML for you instead of asking Storybook to do the rendering. Now, with that in mind, 11D it just doesn't feel like React. It doesn't feel like components. So I wanted to do my 11D development in component-driven development. So I took 11D's short codes, which again, if you know, Jekyll and Hugo is probably kind of familiar, a way to extend your templating, extend your content model to have little units that actually feel a lot like components. You pass things into them, they have a little bit of logic, and they render something. So I've got 11D shortcodes, and I want Storybook to list them, but the problem is Storybook is a React app that executes its JavaScript in the browser engine and has Webpack and all that other kind of stuff on that. And so you were talking a little bit before, Ebenezer, that Storybook, you kind of suspected that Node.js and Webpack were involved. Well, you're kind of right. Storybook doesn't let you run the 11D kinds of things that need Node.js APIs instead of the browser. In my project, I got my package.json. It's got some scripts. I can run 11D, static site generator, in hot loading mode, and it's running down here. I can run Storybook in its hot loading mode. It's running down here. And I've got my component. And what I do on the 11D side is I write a markdown file which uses that component and thus renders it to an HTML file. I'll actually show that. Here's the HTML file. And with this in place, with that file in place, in my story, in my Storybook story, I can go grab it, and I can't read the file system. If I could, it would be so much freaking easier. But I'm in Webpack, which uses the browser engine, which doesn't have the API to read the file system. So the solution, I throw Webpack at it and tell Webpack to import it, because Webpack can transparently import an HTML file as a string, et voila, I return it as the rendered version of the component when the story is using it. And that's the magic of gluing 11D into Storybook. I can go one step further. I could use it in Jest, and I can go get these components and just render them into HTML and make assertions. The idea here is people usually do 11D. They never do Storybook with it. And so I'm trying to do that. Usually people just write their site for 11D. But I want to do component-driven development when I'm doing 11D. And if I'm doing component-driven development, it would be nice to use this tool called Storybook. So how can I do them together? Well, first I have to do components. And so in 11D, I'm organizing my work for components into shortcodes. And so, for example, if I go to the 11 configuration file, you'll see I added a component called header. And once I do that, anywhere in my markdown, people can use this component shortcode. But I want to make sure that this works in all the things you said at the top about reuse and isolation and decomposition and testability and all those things people don't do with 11. They just do a big pile of stuff, render it, see if it looks okay. So the first step I have is I've got my component and I want to write a story for this component. And I want to write it in a way that will plug it into Storybook. So in the file directory, right beside the component, I have a story for that component. And this story, this file has all the variations of header. It will render it all the different ways that you might want to see header based on the logic in your component. Maybe something's disabled. Maybe something for responsive is laid out differently. And once I have this file in this directory for the component, Storybook can discover it and then put it in that browsable listing. I admit it's a bit of an alien idea for these static site generators like Jekyll and Hugo and 11 to think in terms of component-driven development. But I think it's worth giving a try to see if we can get those benefits that you listed at the beginning. Okay, Ebenezer, so the deal is Storybook is kind of heavy.
Yeah, and React projects mean Babel and Webpack and lots of dependencies. So what's the load time and what's the difference?
Let's take a look. How about we go and we'll do a reload of Storybook. But this is a warm reload because it was just running. Let's see how long this takes. Now, it probably isn't a surprise to you that the node modules is... Oh, I'm still in the A's.
Wow.
I'm going to have to speed up.
Yeah, and then the development time is also what we try to avoid, like what we try to minimize when we switch to frameworks like 11 and we don't use React. But then we're back to the same problem, I think.
Right. Indeed, you make a good point. I'm using 11 because I wanted something lighter weight. I didn't want all this crap in my project.
Yeah. And did you actually use Storybook in the final project, your 11 project?
That's a good point. I was looking for lighter weight alternatives on this kind of same idea. I didn't find any that were mature. Storybook does have this idea of a open standard for writing your story JSON files. So maybe that will happen, but in my actual project, I ditched Storybook and kind of wrote Storybook in 11. So
yeah, I don't know. I think Storybook can work well, like in some use cases, but like it's a great idea for many others. In this 11 project case, where you're trying to run away from the all the heaviness that comes with React and other frameworks. Yeah, it can be a good idea, but then when it comes to implementation, it then becomes a lot of stress. You're back to what you were trying to run from or what you're trying to avoid.
Exactly. Okay, so Ebenezer, I've been thinking a lot over the past few years about components versus templates, not just in JavaScript, but in Python. You want to talk about it?
Yeah, and especially how it works with Storybook. What are the differences between components and templates? I know component with React, templates with Vue. Is it the same implementation with Storybook? Using component with Storybook and using templates with Storybook.
Sure. And that kind of is the essential point. I have become a bit disappointed in the world of Python and some parts of JavaScript that are so focused on these things called templates. and they're aimed at non-developers, and they have this parallel programming world where you use something else for for loops and something else for if, and you can't do linting, and you can't do formatting, and you can't do static type checking, and you can't do testing, and you can't do anything that feels like software. Whereas the component model in these front-end tools seems to be aiming at developer experience. And then when we do that, you can really easily hook it up into things like Storybook. Does that make sense?
Okay, yeah. So we go from templates to components, and then components with Storybook. And in summary, Storybook works much better with components than templates, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. You saw the friction I had trying to make short codes, which is a template concept, not a software concept, into components. But again, I'm trying to do the thing you said at the very beginning, the benefits of components, where you have reuse and isolation and decomposition, and combine it with all the things we've grown to love about the tooling that helps us write better software.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's wrap up. First, Ebenezer, you're better than me at this. Do you like this video thing?
Yeah, so if you like this video, you know what to do. Hit the like button. I mean, you should hit the like button. That helps the other people get to see the video. That helps with the YouTube algorithm. And we also want to hear from you comments about Storybook, about component-driven development. Is that the right word? With Storybook with 11T.
Okay, Ebenezer, I'll give you the last word. Do you think components will still be the central idea for front-end development in 2 to 3 years?
Yeah, I think so. Components have been around for, I don't think there's anything that plans to replace components. There are things that can come and make working with components much better. But the idea that we can break our code base into different chunks that are reusable, customizable, and can even be used in and outside of our code base. Yeah, I don't see a future where we'll need to do something else, unless something like that's much better.
Okay, that's it for us today. Ebenezer, thanks for talking with me about components and stories and Storybook and 11E and even JavaScript engines.
Yeah, this has been a really interesting conversation, and I got to learn about 11T and Storybook. So,
Sure.
yeah, happy we did this.
All right, bye, everybody.
Bye.